You walk through the temple gates at first light, the horizon still painted in the faint gold of dawn. The air is thick with the scent of burning sandalwood, its smoke curling in the warm breeze like restless spirits. Bells toll in the distance, their chimes blending with the murmur of priests chanting in a language older than the stones beneath your feet. All around, carved pillars rise toward the sky, their surfaces alive with scenes of gods and lovers entwined in frozen ecstasy. It is everything you imagined ancient India to be, serene, sacred, steeped in wisdom. This is the land of meditation and harmony, where the mind seeks liberation and the soul moves toward the divine. For a moment, you believe it. Then you hear the sound. It is sharp, wet, and rhythmic, a noise that cuts through the chanting. You follow it into the temple courtyard, where the crowd gathers in a circle, eyes fixed on a figure at the center. There, suspended in the open air, a man hangs from two thick iron hooks driven deep into the flesh of his back. The skin stretches unnaturally under the weight, trembling as the ropes creak overhead. Blood traces a slow, deliberate path down his spine before vanishing into the folds of crimson cloth tied at his waist. The priests step closer, circling him like planets around a sun. They sprinkle flowers over his head and smear ash across his chest. His lips move soundlessly, whispering prayers you cannot hear, and then a signal is given. The ropes tighten. He spins. First a slow turn, then faster, the hooks tearing wider as the crowd begins to chant louder, their voices rising into a fevered roar. Women throw handfuls of petals into the air, men stretch their arms upward, as if to catch whatever blessing falls from his suffering. The man's eyes close. His mouth curls into something between a grimace and a smile. The air is heavy with the mingling of incense and iron, perfume and blood. You feel it coat your tongue, cling to your skin. The priests speak of fertility, of sacred ecstasy, of divine union between pain and pleasure. Every pull of the rope is an offering. Every drop of blood, a prayer. You want to look away, but the crowd presses in, drawing you closer. A child tugs at his mother's hand, laughing. An old woman begins to weep. The man spins faster still, and in that dizzying blur of flesh and devotion, you see the truth. This is no punishment. This is worship. And it is only the beginning. What lies beyond these gates will not be the India of painted scrolls or gentle songs. Here, the gods do not always ask for your devotion, sometimes, they demand your body. And before you leave, you will understand how far devotion can go when sanctity and desire become one. Beyond the courtyard, the crowd moves as one body, flowing toward the great hall where the true ceremony waits. The air grows hotter, heavy with the oil of burning lamps. Shadows dance on the stone walls, their shapes twisting into forms both human and divine. The priests lead the way, their voices deepening into a chant that vibrates through the floor, through your bones. At the center of the hall, an empty space has been cleared. The walls are lined with carvings that leave nothing to the imagination, bodies interlocked, limbs tangled, faces frozen in the trance of pleasure. The figures seem to watch you, their eyes hollow but unblinking. A drum begins to beat, slow and steady, like the pulse of something alive. From the far side, two figures step forward, a man and a woman draped in thin silks, their bodies painted with patterns of red and gold. They are not lovers, at least not in the way you understand it. They are chosen. Selected by the temple elders to stand before the gods and the people, to act as vessels for the union of the divine. The priests encircle them, murmuring prayers, sprinkling them with water drawn from the sacred tank. Incense coils upward in thick ribbons, veiling the faces of the onlookers but leaving the chosen pair exposed. The drums quicken. The chanting grows louder. Then the priest gives a single nod, and the ritual begins. The man and woman move toward each other with the slow certainty of those who cannot turn back. Every gesture, every touch, is deliberate, part of a choreography handed down through centuries. They do not speak. They do not need to. The crowd watches in silence broken only by the drumbeat, as their bodies intertwine beneath the watching eyes of the gods. This is not private. It was never meant to be. In this place, the act itself is not hidden, it is the offering. The temple stands as witness, the community stands as judge, and the gods, it is believed, stand to receive. For the chosen, there is no choice. Refusal would bring not only disgrace, but the weight of divine disfavor. A man who falters might be stripped of his status, marked as weak, unworthy of leadership. A woman who resists could face the loss of her family's honor, the whispers of being cursed, unfit for marriage. In some towns, they say, a failed participant was paraded through the streets, mocked and pelted with ashes. The audience does not watch in silence for long. They begin to chant the names of the gods, their voices urging the pair forward. The priests sometimes step closer, their hands guiding the rhythm, correcting the movement, ensuring the performance meets the sacred standard. This is not only ritual, it is inspection. Every gesture is measured against the weight of tradition. In the far corners of the hall, you see more than common villagers. Draped in jewels and seated on raised platforms, the elites of the city watch with cool interest. Nobles, merchants, and even rulers attend these rites, not as passive witnesses, but as arbiters. Some have paid for the right to stand close, to see the act in detail, to judge whether the gods will be pleased. The chosen pair's bodies gleam under the torchlight, their painted skin smeared now with sweat and oil. The chants reach a pitch that shakes the air, and when the final movement comes, it is met not with silence, but with a roar. The people cheer as if a battle has been won. The priests lift their arms in triumph, declaring that the gods have been honored. The man and woman are led away, their faces unreadable. Whether they feel pride or shame is their secret, but the law of this place ensures they will never speak of it openly. If you leave without subscribing, you're choosing not to remember these people the way they really lived. That's how history gets rewritten into lies. In the quiet that follows the ritual, the crowd disperses into the temple's inner corridors, but not all leave. You notice a smaller procession forming, led by a high-ranking priest whose gold-threaded robes glimmer in the torchlight. Behind him walks a girl, no more than 10 or 11, her head bowed, her feet bare. Anklets jingle softly with each step, a delicate sound almost lost beneath the low murmur of those watching. Her hair is freshly oiled, adorned with white jasmine flowers that trail down her back. Around her neck hangs a small amulet, the sign that she is no longer her parents' daughter, but the bride of a god. Today is her dedication. The ceremony begins before the shrine's inner sanctum, where the air is thick with incense so strong it burns your throat. The girl kneels, and the priest smears a line of red kumkum across her forehead. Prayers are chanted, the conch horn sounds, and garlands are draped over her shoulders. There are no tears. She has been told since birth that this is an honor beyond measure. She will serve the deity, live within the temple walls, and never marry a mortal man. For a moment, it seems pure, an act of devotion. But as the prayers end, the truth begins to take shape in the shifting glances of the men nearby. This is not only a spiritual bond, it is the beginning of a life that belongs to the temple, body and soul. At first, she will learn the dances performed during festivals, dances meant to honor the god but designed to captivate human eyes. She will sing the hymns, her voice rising through the carved halls. She will serve food to visiting patrons, offer them flowers, attend to their comfort. But as she grows older, her duties will change. The temple receives wealthy visitors, merchants seeking blessings for their voyages, landowners hoping for fertile fields, nobles arriving in palanquins carried by sweating men. These patrons bring gifts of gold, grain, and precious stones. In return, they expect not only spiritual favor, but the pleasures whispered about in the markets. When the time comes, the girl will be summoned, dressed in silks finer than she has ever worn, and sent to a private chamber. There will be no refusal. The god's bride cannot deny the god's guests, for to serve them is to serve the deity himself, or so the priests will tell her. From that point on, her sacred service will be indistinguishable from servitude. The temple will collect offerings from every patron who visits her. A portion will go to the upkeep of the shrine, but much will line the pockets of the priests and the families who brokered her dedication. She will not see the wealth her body earns. Foreign travelers recorded what they saw with a mixture of fascination and disgust. Some, like the Portuguese chroniclers, marveled at the grace of the temple dancers, noting their beauty and performances under moonlit courtyards. Others wrote with unease about the whispered arrangements, the way religious devotion and desire mingled so openly here. They could not reconcile the holiness of the shrine with the transactions that sustained it. For the Devadasi herself, there will be no escape. She cannot marry outside the temple, she is already wed to the god. If she grows too old or too ill to serve, she may be cast out, left to survive as best she can on the edges of the city. Yet the system will continue, each girl replaced by another, her story swallowed by the chanting and the ringing of bells. If you won't subscribe, say why in the comments. Silence is what allowed this system to survive for centuries. Beyond the temple walls, the same mingling of sanctity and desire took on a grander, more dangerous form inside the palaces of kings. Here, devotion was replaced by indulgence, and the gods were not the only ones demanding service. The royal harem was a world hidden behind stone walls and carved gates, a labyrinth of courtyards, shaded pavilions, and pools scented with rosewater. At its heart stood the pleasure gardens, acres of carefully tended flowers, fruit trees heavy with ripening sweetness, and fountains that whispered under the heat of the midday sun. But these gardens were not only for beauty. They were the stage where desire became politics. The women who lived here were more than companions. They were prizes of war, tributes from defeated rulers, gifts from foreign merchants eager to please. Some had been courtesans of rare skill, brought to the harem for their talents in dance, music, or conversation. Others were daughters of noble houses, placed here to secure alliances. They lived in a world of silk and gold, but every glance, every gesture, carried weight. The ruler's favor could transform a life, turning a concubine into a queen, her family into the most powerful in the kingdom. But his displeasure could end it just as quickly. Service here meant more than beauty. It meant obedience to desires spoken and unspoken. It meant knowing how to please a man who was accustomed to having every wish fulfilled without question. The rules of survival were unwritten, but absolute. A woman who failed to hold his interest could find herself sent away in disgrace, stripped of her jewels, her family's fortune reduced overnight. A more serious failure, refusal, insult, or the hint of betrayal, could mean exile to the farthest reaches of the kingdom, or worse, death. It was not only the women who lived under this shadow. Men, too, were drawn into the harem's politics. Musicians, poets, and servants who entertained the ruler could rise to prominence, rewarded with land and wealth. But if a royal consort whispered displeasure in the wrong ear, or if the ruler suspected any private dealings, the punishment was merciless. For men assigned to the ruler's intimate service, the cost of failure was often mutilation. A concubine who accused her attendant of impropriety could see him castrated before the sun set. In some courts, execution was favored, a swift beheading in the garden's edge, the blood soaking into the soil where jasmine grew. The act was both punishment and warning, a reminder to all who served that the king's pleasure was law. The contrast between palace life and the world beyond its gates was stark. For the ruler and his chosen, public displays of desire were celebrated. The king could host moonlit gatherings in the gardens, inviting poets to recite verses that grew increasingly erotic as the night wore on. He could order fountains to run with scented oils, command dancers to perform naked beneath the stars, and reward favorites with gold for the night's entertainment. But outside the palace, the same acts could mean ruin. A commoner caught in public with his lover might be paraded through the streets, lashed before a jeering crowd, or forced to pay fines that would take years to repay. Laws that forbade women from showing their faces in public had no bearing inside the palace, where the ruler's wives and concubines could display themselves freely before a select audience. This division was not an accident, it was a display of power. The king's pleasures were a visible reminder that his desires existed above the reach of the laws that bound his subjects. The palace walls did not just separate the rulers from the ruled, they separated what was permitted from what was punishable. In the harem's silence, alliances rose and fell. A glance could be the start of a conspiracy. A whispered word could set a rival's destruction in motion. The women learned to read each other's movements as carefully as soldiers read the enemy's ranks. Servants learned to pass messages without speaking. Every day was a performance, and the cost of a single mistake could not be undone. To live here was to understand that beauty could be as dangerous as a sword, and that desire, when wielded by those with power, could command loyalty, destroy lives, or shape the fate of an entire kingdom. Beyond the palaces and harems, another kind of power reigned, the spiritual class. To the common eye, these were men of unshakable discipline, wandering ascetics who owned nothing, ate little, and kept their gaze fixed on the divine. Their bodies were wrapped in coarse cloth, their hair matted with ash, their eyes often closed in meditation. They preached restraint, chastity, and the rejection of worldly pleasure. For the poor, these men were living examples of the ideal, that the body was a vessel to be mastered, and desire a temptation to be crushed. Laws supported this ideal with an iron hand. A village laborer accused of indecent conduct toward a woman could be stripped, beaten, and driven from his home. An unmarried couple caught in a moment of intimacy could face public humiliation, their names spoken with scorn for years to come. But behind closed doors, in the hidden chambers of certain temples and the walled gardens of the elite, another truth thrived. Here, the same spiritual leaders who preached abstinence presided over secret rites in which restraint was not a virtue, but a hindrance. Under the banner of Tantra, gatherings were held where bodies became instruments of worship. Invitations were whispered, never written, passed among select circles of merchants, nobles, and priests. Within the flickering light of oil lamps, men and women painted with sacred symbols moved together in choreographed rituals. Every gesture, every touch, was cloaked in the language of devotion, but it was the body, its arousal, its release, that was the true offering. The paradox was stark. In public, a wandering monk could be shunned or punished for showing the smallest sign of arousal, a wandering thought made visible in the body. In private, a priest of the same standing could guide participants in a rite where such arousal was celebrated as a channel to divine truth. The same act that brought ruin to a peasant could elevate the status of an elite practitioner, provided it happened in the right room, under the right priest's gaze. This hypocrisy was etched into the very stones of the land. Many of the great temples rose from their foundations covered in intricate carvings, gods, humans, and mythical beings entwined in poses that left nothing to the imagination. Visitors would stand in awe at their craftsmanship, but their meanings were explained only in whispers. The images were celebrated as sacred art, symbols of cosmic union. Yet in the villages beyond those walls, a woman accused of immodesty for showing her ankle could face disgrace. For the elite, erotic imagery was spiritual symbolism. For the poor, erotic reality was a moral crime. The difference lay not in the act, but in who committed it and under whose authority. Those who took part in the hidden tantric rites understood the stakes. The gatherings were held at night, often in isolated courtyards or temple rooms guarded by trusted attendants. Offerings were made, chants were spoken, and as the ritual deepened, distinctions between worshipper and worshipped blurred. Participants claimed they felt the gods themselves move through them, their bodies becoming temples, their pleasure transformed into prayer. But these gatherings were not open to all. Wealth, status, and influence were the unspoken requirements. Those who lacked them could only guess at what happened inside, piecing together rumors from the fragments told by servants or disgraced participants who had been cast out. If you can listen to this and walk away without subscribing, ask yourself: are you learning history, or just consuming it? When punishment took the form of public theater, it was designed not merely to correct, but to brand the soul with shame that would outlive the body. In marketplaces, at crossroads, and before the steps of temples, the condemned were displayed for all to see, their humiliation crafted into a spectacle that blurred the line between justice and entertainment. A woman accused of adultery might be stripped to the waist and forced to walk the length of the city, her hair cut short in uneven clumps, her feet bare on scorching stone. The crowd would follow, some jeering, some silent, all watching. At every turn, a crier would call out her name and crime, so there would be no doubt who she was or why she suffered. She could not cover herself, her arms were bound. By the time she reached the final square, the shame had seeped so deep that her name would no longer be spoken in her own household. For men, the punishments could be more visibly violent. Branding irons, heated until they glowed white, were pressed against the skin, the mark chosen to match the crime. A thief might bear the symbol of a broken chain, a man accused of sexual impropriety might be branded with a crude depiction of the act itself. The mark was burned into the arm, the chest, or even the face, where it could never be hidden. This was a sentence without end, for even after the flesh healed, the scar spoke on his behalf to everyone he met. Some punishments were designed to degrade the victim completely, stripping them of any shred of dignity. A man accused of assaulting a woman of higher caste could be made to crawl on his hands and knees through the busiest streets, dragging a heavy stone tied to his waist, while whom. In some places, offenders were forced to wear garlands of bones or shoes around their necks, symbols of impurity, while people spat at their feet. Foreign travelers, drawn by curiosity or duty, recorded what they saw with uneasy fascination. Arab merchants described the naked parades of women, noting how the faces of the onlookers shifted from mockery to something colder, a satisfaction in seeing the high brought low. Portuguese chroniclers wrote of men branded in front of temple gates, their screams mingling with the ringing of sacred bells, the punishment carried out under the eyes of the gods. Some accounts spoke of musicians playing during the processions, turning shame into a kind of parade, the rhythm of drums masking the sound of sobbing. In these spectacles, the cruelty lay not only in the act, but in its permanence. A fine could be paid, a prison term served, but public humiliation could not be erased. It followed the condemned into every interaction, every transaction, every glance in the marketplace. For many, exile became the only way forward, but even in a distant city, the memory of the punishment traveled faster than they could. The crowd, too, bore a role in this ritual. Their presence gave the act its power. Without witnesses, humiliation loses its teeth. And so they came, farmers leaving their fields, merchants closing their stalls, children pushed forward by their parents to see and learn. The lesson was simple: the body could be broken, the name could be dirted, and both could be paraded until the person was no longer a person at all, but a warning. If you won't subscribe, tell us in the comments why these people don't deserve to be remembered for what they endured. In the dim corridors where the temple's incense could not mask the stench of sweat and damp stone, another trade moved quietly, one that fed both the sanctuaries and the brothels of the cities. Children, bought, traded, or given away, formed the invisible foundation of an economy that no law dared to touch. Some were sold by desperate parents, their families drowning in debt, their fields barren after years of poor harvests. Others were taken in raids, captured from villages along trade routes and marched for days to the city. There were those given as offerings to the gods, their arrival wrapped in the language of devotion but stripped of choice from the moment they crossed the temple threshold. In the brothels, their youth was the commodity. Wealthy patrons would pay more for the youngest faces, the softest voices, the bodies that had not yet borne the mark of age or labor. In the temples, these children were draped in ceremonial cloth, their service cloaked in ritual. Publicly, they were blessed before the god's image, the priests placing garlands over their shoulders, smearing their foreheads with vermilion, and declaring their life to be one of holy service. Privately, they were trained to perform dances and recitations meant to please not only the deity, but the men who paid the temple's keepers for access. The ritual blessing gave the illusion of protection, a shield of sanctity that kept interference at bay. Who would dare accuse the priests of corruption when the children's service was said to be divine will? Even the rulers, who might have had the power to intervene, were often the ones benefiting, their palaces supplied with temple-trained attendants, their festivals brightened by the performances of children taken far from the homes they could barely remember. Laws, when they existed, were written to guard the wealth and reputation of the institutions, not the bodies within them. A child bound to a temple could not marry, could not leave without permission, could not testify against the men who used them. In the brothels, any injury was measured not in human terms, but in loss of value to the owner. Foreign chroniclers spoke cautiously of what they saw. Some accounts from traders in the southern ports hinted at the festival children, who appeared only during certain seasons, their presence explained as part of sacred drama but whose absence for the rest of the year was never questioned. Others, braver or more outraged, wrote of the auctions held discreetly behind markets, where girls and boys were displayed for inspection, their ages announced alongside their talents. The network that sustained this trade was intricate. Brokers who knew which villages were most vulnerable. Merchants who transported the children hidden among goods. Priests who sanctified their arrival. Courtesans who taught them the performances that would ensure their survival. Every link in the chain profited, and every link had reason to keep it unbroken. For the children, survival depended on obedience, on learning quickly what pleased their masters, on swallowing the memory of the family they once had. Those who resisted could be beaten, starved, or sold again, this time to harsher owners, where even the pretense of ritual vanished. Some grew into their roles so completely that they could no longer imagine another life. Others held on to the hope of escape, but without money, allies, or legal standing, escape was little more than a thought to cling to in the dark. And for most, the years passed until youth faded, and with it their value, leaving them discarded at the edge of the same streets where they had once been taken. If you refuse to subscribe, you're leaving their stories to vanish like they never existed. Explain why in the comments. Her name survives in a brittle palm leaf manuscript, tucked away in the archives of a coastal temple. The ink is faded, but her story is clear. She was called Sannyasi, though she was no ascetic. The name was meant to honor the god she had been bound to as a child. She was given to the temple at the age of 9. Her family told that she would serve the deity and bring blessings to her village. The dedication ceremony was lavish, garlands of marigold, drums echoing through the courtyard, priests declaring that she now belonged to the divine. The villagers believed it. Perhaps, on that day, she believed it too. In her first years, she danced during festivals, her anklets ringing as she spun before the idol, her movements practiced until they seemed effortless. Patrons tossed coins at her feet, the temple coffers grew heavier, and her name became known among the city's elites. But when she reached 14, her role changed. The dances moved from the public square to private rooms. The patrons who had once watched from afar now summoned her directly. Each visit was explained as an offering to the god, but the offerings were taken by men, not deities. By 16, she had been sent beyond the temple walls to the palace for the king's pleasure. The gardens there were filled with jasmine and night-blooming flowers, their sweetness masking the truth of her nights. She had no right to refuse, no path to leave. In the mornings, she returned to the temple, her body sore, her silks replaced with the simple cotton of a servant until she was called again. Her punishment came not for disobedience, but for arousing the jealousy of a favored consort. She was accused of seduction, a crime absurd in its hypocrisy, yet deadly in its consequence. The verdict was public shaming, her hair hacked away, her anklets torn from her feet, her face marked with ash. She was paraded through the streets where, years earlier, she had danced to applause. Some villagers averted their eyes, others whispered. No one intervened. When she was finally released from temple service in her 30s, she had no family to return to, no land, no wealth. She took work in the harbor markets, carrying loads for traders, her back bent from years of labor both sacred and profane. Yet she lived long enough to tell her story to a traveling scribe, who recorded it in the margins of a devotional text, the only reason her name has not been erased entirely. In her life, every contradiction of her age was bound together, the beauty of devotion and the ugliness of its misuse, the promise of protection and the reality of possession, the sanctity of the temple and the greed that hollowed it from within. She was both honored and degraded, exalted and discarded. The line between devotion and exploitation was paper thin, and it still is. In the next episode of Grim Histories, we will journey to another corner of the ancient world, where loyalty, betrayal, and blood shaped an empire's fate. What was celebrated as justice then will chill you to hear now. If you have listened this far, you already know that stories like sannyasi's vanish unless someone is willing to keep them alive. Subscribe, so they are not buried twice.